evening, and thank you for joining the USF Lecture Series, a virtual program of the Allen County Public Library. My name is Mark Eber. I'm the Assistant Manager of the Aboite branch, and I will be the moderator for this evening's program. This program is being recorded. In order to improve the quality of everyone's listening experience, your microphones have been muted. If you have a question or comment, please use the chat function at the bottom of the page. We will facilitate questions and answers through the chat function. The purpose of the USF Lecture Series is to provide information on topics of interest to the residents of Allen County from experts in their field, and to provide the faculty members of USF with the ability to share their passion for their subjects with the library's patron. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Clifford E. Buttram, Jr., Assistant Professor of Management and Director of the Masters of Business Administration and Masters of Organizational Leadership programs at the University of St. Francis. His presentation this evening provides a historical background and foundation for how we arrived at the current global economy and how it may soon fundamentally change. Please make Dr. Buttram feel welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I bid you greetings from the University of St. Francis, and I'm really honored to be able to be the first of a select group of University of St. Francis professors to be able to speak with you on topics of our interest. But first, I'd like to thank Mark Eber and Kay Gregg for placing this and getting this together and ensuring that everything is set up for this first time working this in a virtual presentation. So this evening, I'm going to talk to you about the future of the global economy. Now, anytime you talk about the future, you really have to start with the past. And so part of this evening will be really a history lesson. And you may not like history, or you may not like the historical context or anything associated with thinking in the past or looking in the past. But bear with me, and as we go through this, hopefully you will take a different perspective on how the past really is indicative of where we're going in terms of the global economy. I'd like to say about 12 years ago, a little over 12 years ago, I retired from the Army. And interestingly enough, the hair you see on my face was on top of my head and vice versa. It's kind of interesting to see what happens in 12 years. But a lot of what I will speak of tonight, I learned through being part and being able to visit, tour, deploy to 11 different countries, and utilize some of that experience and continue to use it in my professional duties here at University of St. Francis. So about 15 years ago, I was in about the first year, the third of 3 years of being a professor of military science at Eastern Michigan University. And I was asked to go to a course called the Military History Instructors course. And what was very interesting about this was that I thought, hey, I was going to learn everything I needed to know about military history so I could come back and create a program for our cadets. Well, all that changed really the first 5 minutes of the course. So the very first instructor who came up flatly stated this: we are not here to teach you military history. We're here to teach you how to teach military history. So this evening, I'm not going to teach you or profess to you or lecture you about the future of the global economy. But what I really like to do is place in the context and perspective how we got here and where we're going. So it's not what, it's more of a how. And if you're able to see the first, the photo here on the first slide, it's a picture of the globe. And you might say, well, that's not the globe. It's not round. Well, it is round. It's just a different perspective. And hopefully by the end of about 40 minutes this evening, you'll have a different perspective on our global economy and really the United States' role in it. You might also see me periodically through the next 40 minutes take a tissue here and wipe my forehead. It's relatively warm in here, but I really do think by the end of this, we will all learn something new. What is war? So you're probably thinking, oh my God, he's already talking about war, but I thought this was about the economy. Well, what is war? You may have heard of Baron Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian military theorist. Before Germany was Germany, the aristocrats of what was to be Germany were called Prussians. And this was a Prussian military theorist. War is a continuation of politics by other means. So really, if we can't solve our problems by talking and trying to come to a resolution, well, then the next step is we come to blows, quite simply and quite frankly. And then we can come back and talk about the politics. That really was his view. Now, Sun Tzu, really about 500 BC, Chinese general strategist, said the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without even fighting. You can win without even coming to blows. So these are two perspectives on war. Now, if I interjected what is a trade war into that title, and then you look at the context of both of these theorists and strategists, what would you think? So as I go through this evening, I'll give some quizzes. I'll leave some open-ended questions such as, what do you think? Hold on to that thought, because everything's interconnected in the slides here. But what is a trade war? Is it a war of politics by other means? Or is it an art? Is it an art to subdue your trade enemy without even fighting? You may have heard of these two terms here, geopolitics and geoeconomics. So really these two nomenclatures, names, have really come into the verbiage really in the last 20 years. So what is geopolitics? Anything with politics in it means it's foreign policy, or you're studying, or you're explaining. You look at the definition here, you're really predicting. An example I have here is the United States and China. So now we're talking about the number one and the number two economy in the world. So, and it's been that way now for about 20 years. And so one tries to gain advantage of the other, trying to understand, trying to explain how can I displace number one? And number one is really concerned about how do I not get displaced? And so they try to predict international behavior through geographical barriers. Geography, geopolitics, and geoeconomics is really about the globe, and it's really about geography. If you look at that picture there, it really is a very slow-moving, large-scale chess game. And it's really a chess game in 2020 between China and the United States, or the United States and China, depending on your perspective. Geoeconomics. Now, these economic instruments to promote and defend national interests and produce geographical results. So if you're familiar with geography, and you know where Japan lies on the globe, which is not too far from China, but it's an ally of us, the United States. So geoeconomically, Japan is the fourth largest economy in the world. The fourth largest economy, a country the size of California. But geoeconomically, we really are interconnected with the Japanese to help in the geopolitical stasis between the United States and China. So this is really just a really brief example of the difference between geopolitics and geoeconomics. I like to term this Frankensteinisms. We all know the story of Frankenstein. Man tried to create a version of himself, turned out to be something completely horrible. And it ended well for both the creator and the created. So the Frankensteinisms here is the intent may have been a model, but the result was not. And so when you look at all these isms here, I'm going to read you very briefly what the definitions of these are, because they play into everything as we go forward toward the end of this presentation. What is mercantilism? Basically, it's to maximize a country's exports and minimize the imports. So take the United States. we have a wealth of agricultural products: wheat, soybean, corn. We actually have so much food that we just cannot utilize it all. So we have it at a surplus where we can actually sell it, trade it at prices that are beneficial to us. Then there are those who need it, where they have to buy it at a price that may not be affordable to them. So hundreds, thousands of years ago, mercantilism is really what started the global economy. I have something that you need it. You can't make it or produce it. So I can actually hold over you how much I charge you for that, because you actually need it. And that's how the world worked for quite a long time. Every country produced something different. Every other country was not able to produce what they wanted or needed, and that's mercantilism. Now I want you to go over to the right side of the slide where it says colonialism. Here's a definition of this. So a country extends or retains a country's authority over other people or territories. So if you're a mercantilist, and you're a very good one, well, what stops you from coming to another country and actually conducting mercantilism in that country? If we think of colonialism, and let's say Europe and Africa, or Europe and India, or the French in Indochina, what we're talking about here is that another country who has the means and the will and the wherewithal to actually extend mercantilism inside of another country. And that colonialism has appeared not too long after mercantilism became such the way the world traded. But colonialism ended up becoming a more efficient means of trading. But it eventually became another country not subduing, but utilizing the actual country's resources and people to increase their mercantilism. You can also think of how the Middle East was created. We'll talk about that a little later. And actually our country, North America, was once a colony of Great Britain. So we had a war about that 250 odd years ago, and we were no longer a colony. But that's exactly what the British were working with when they were dealing with us in the late 1700s. Imperialism. As you notice as I go down the slides, they're becoming more and more funneled. So imperialism is really an ideology. It's extending the rule or authority of one country over other countries. So how is that different from colonialism? Well, imperialism, again, is an ideology. Think of the Romans. So the Romans were in Italy, but they really were all over what is now Europe, founding France, Germany, England, spreading democracy. Through their Roman legions, they were everywhere. That is a form of imperialism. It's not that they conquered other countries, they did, but they were spreading what they thought was the better way of governing a country. You can also think of imperialism in an economic term or in a military term. Nationalism. Now, nationalism is really the opposite of imperialism. And think just very briefly about interwar Germany, Japan, and even Italy. Think of Hitler. Think of Mussolini. Think of the Japanese Emperor Hirohito. All of them very nationalist in their viewpoints, to the point that I don't really need another country to do anything for me. Matter of fact, my country is such that I can self-govern, I can self-determine, and because I can do that very well, that eventually spread to other countries. And again, take a hard look and a hard thought about Hitler, Hirohito, and Mussolini right before World War II started. Now we know what capitalism is. We live in it. It's an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production. And communism, of course, is a collective means of that. It's very interesting that after World War II, that the majority of the countries in the world today are not communist. There's very, very few that are communist, including the breakup of the Soviet Union. But most of the countries in the world, the majority, are either presidential republics, constitutional parliamentarian republics, constitutional monarchies. The key word is constitution, which equates to democracy. That didn't occur until after the end of World War II and up until today. Really, the only communist countries left, North Korea. You've heard probably enough about that. That is a strict dictatorship, one-party communist state. Cuba, some respects Venezuela. Russia's not even communist anymore. Neither is China. We'll get to that here in a second too. And the last one I'll talk about here is what's really occurring now, and that is regionalism. So what is that? Well, think of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And think of what just came into effect July 1st of this year, which is depending on who you listen to, what you read, it's really an improved NAFTA, the USMCA. But really what this does is it creates 3 countries that are in the top 10 economies in the world that essentially have open borders. You can produce products, trade within these 3 countries without tariffs or low tariffs. And what you create is really a bulwark against your primary economic foe, China. So if you've not studied what NAFTA was or what the USMCA is, you'd be well worth it to do that, because it was really designed, think of it about mercantilism. We're talking about the number 1 and number 2 economies in the world. I like to say just a little piece about Mexico, because it's very interesting how Mexico is formed. So our country is a presidential republic, so is Mexico. We have 50 states, Mexico has 32. Our states have their own Congress and their own constitution, so do the 32 states in Mexico. In essence, the 2 countries have identical governments. If you watch enough news, you think Mexico wasn't anything like America, but its government is just like the American government. Why wouldn't we have a USMCA? Now, the Canadians are a constitutional monarchy, still kind of under the auspices of England. However, it's run by a constitution and a prime minister. Regionalism will be the new mercantilism. Oh, got it now. These 2 slides real quickly. Empires, the road from empires to what we call nation states. And I'm going to cover 1919 very quickly and 70 years up to the end of the Cold War. So the World War I, and I'm going to have about 3 slides on World War I, because it really is what brought us here to 2020. But that enduring geopolitical ramifications of World War II, and I say geopolitical and not geoeconomic. You might not know, but 101 years ago, at the end of World War I, the modern Middle East was created. Many countries that are named today actually came out of this treaty. And World War II is no longer, it's probably thought of as ancient history. It's really only 3 generations ago. And 101 years ago, the world changed. And this is really how we ended up with where we are in 2020. In 1954, we had the beginning of the end of colonialism. So after World War II, the British and the French were really financially depleted to the point where they could not prop up their colonies anymore. And so in 1954, if you ever heard of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, where the French were just annihilated by the Vietnamese, and really were embarrassed, asked us to help. President Eisenhower said no, and that really was the end of French colonialism and the beginning of the end of it in areas like Africa and Southeast Asia. Fast forward to the end of the Cold War, 1989. Many of you may remember when the Berlin Wall fell, but then that ended two dichotomous world viewpoints, communism and capitalism. Capitalism won. I'll talk about that here in just a sec. The second part of this is now we're from nation states to regionalism, back to regionalism again. So now we have economic unions. Really, this came into play in 1992. European Union came into play. And the real purpose for this was to not have another European war like World War I or World War II. The globe couldn't take it. And by this time, the economy was so interconnected at that particular time that any type of shooting war that was global would affect everyone. If you take a look at the two or the three pictures on the left side of the slide, and we talk about regionalism, the far upper left one, you may recognize that city. That's New York, New York City. To the right of that, that's London. And if you can't guess what the bottom picture is, it might look like an American city, it might look like a British city, but it's not, it's Beijing. And what's interesting is that in this game of regionalism we're in now, these three countries are really where we're going to end up moving from 2020 through the next 15 years. We are now in a period of global trade and commerce that is so interconnected that fighting a war on the likes of World War I or World War II probably will not occur. It will affect the entire globe to the point where it will affect every country's economy. Let me go back to how this all started. And again, this is the history lesson part. Let's go backwards so you can see how we got here today. Look at this picture. This is the Hall of Mirrors in Paris, 1919. After World War I ended in November 1918, it took 6 months to hash out a treaty. And you may not be able to see it, but the three men sitting in the middle right there, one of them is the US President Woodrow Wilson. The other one is the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. And then the third one, he's in the picture, he's the British Prime Minister George Lloyd. Those three were essentially the victors in World War I. Now, this particular war ended empires. Empires, if you understand, really were about mercantilism and colonialism. But this war ended four of those empires: the Germans, the Ottomans, which were the Middle East, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian empires. Ended them. You haven't heard the word empire since that time. Three countries ended up reshaping the world. And when I say reshaping the world, actually created countries out of the blue in 6 months here in Paris. You may not know, but Ho Chi Minh, who became the leader of Vietnam while we were fighting the Vietnam, was actually in Paris trying to negotiate to have a separate Vietnam in 1919. He wasn't heard, he wasn't listened to. He even was articulating that he studied the US Constitution. They simply just wanted to be free. They wanted to be a nation state. Ho Chi Minh was there. This particular treaty, those three victors, the Russians weren't there because the Russians had really a year, 2 years before this said, "I'm done." They had the Russian Revolution. They went from becoming an empire to become a communist state. So they weren't even invited to come to the treaty. And neither were the Germans. This was really about the Germans. Let's punish them for starting this war. How did all this stuff start? It was all not written treaties, but verbal treaties between nations. A Serbian assassinates an Austro-Hungarian Ferdinand, who was the leader of Austria, Prince of Austro-Hungary. Well, The Russians were allies of Serbia. The Germans were allies of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary tells Serbia, give me an ultimatum. Give me the guy, give me some money, stop this, or I'm going to mobilize my army. Germans support the Austrians. The Russians support the Serbians. The French are allied with the Russians. They declare war on Germany. Germany declares war on France. Germany declares war on Russia. And all of a sudden, in the span of 30 days, is the start of this 4-year cataclysmic war that reshaped the world. The last bullet there, this really helped to create our current globally interconnected world of trade and economics. This is a very interesting slide. If I can just bear with me on this, this may surprise you, really might. Might be difficult to see the map on the left. Color-coded, you can see Germany, you can see the empires, you can see each country. But look at the statistics on the right. Now, when I go from the top to the bottom, I'm going from least to most. And I'll just say least to most. The way you read this, the way it's set up, look at England. There's 42 million people in England in World War I. Of those 42 million, 10 million actually served in the military. 900,000 died, which is about 9%, and 2.1 million of them were wounded. So 24 plus 9, what is that, 33%. 1 in 3 persons, men, who were in the military and were in World War I were either killed or wounded. Go down to Russia, very large country, has always been populous. You can see their statistics. They had many more soldiers, sailors, 20 million. But you're still talking over 30% casualty rates. Let's get to Germany. Now Germany sits right in the middle of Russia, France, Austria, Hungary. Pretty good sized country. They were able to mobilize 16 million men. 1.7 million of those 16 million died and 4.2 million were wounded. Now we're up to 37%. Look at the Ottomans. They really had no business even participating in this, but they did. They had the smallest population. The Ottomans are really the Turks. What is now Turkey, part of Syria, that portion of the world. 18.5 million people, 2.5 million served, 750,000 died. But look at that, 750,000 were wounded. 27 plus 26%. Nearly half of the men they sent in were injured or killed. Austria-Hungary, it's much like Germany. It's in the middle of everything. But I want you to look at the numbers there. 18% that served died, 46% were wounded. That's 64%. That means 2 out of 3 men that served were injured or killed. Now, the last one I want to tell you about is France. Now, France is France. I've had the opportunity to go to France, and the French are the French, okay? If you listen to one side or the other, some may say some things about the French, others may say some other things about the French, but look at this particular stat. So France, relatively 38 million people, mobilized 8.5 million men, 1.3 million died, 4.2 million were wounded. Look at that, 64%. 2 out of every 3 Frenchmen that went to the front either died or came back wounded. And when we say wounded, we're saying wounded, legs missing, arms missing, unable to really be productive in society. And so France almost bled herself dry in the span of 4 years. A country the size of Texas, if you can imagine our state of Texas, losing half of its men over the course of 4 years. This is just a perspective of what World War I and how it has shaped us today. Quickly here, we're talking about the victors and the vanquished, end of empires, created the Middle East. The Ottomans lost. Now you end up with Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, which wasn't called that, it was just called Arabia. You're talking about the partition of the Palestinians and the Jews. All of this occurred in the inner years after World War I. But World War I, the conclusion of it started it. Created the USSR. Sure, a lot of you remember that. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That was the communist Russia. Dissolved. Now it's the Russian Federation. It was Russia, then it was the Soviet Union, now it's the Russian Federation. They're Russians. So World War I was really the illusion of peace through the disillusion of cooperation. And if you're ever around in November and you're at an American Legion or you stop at a stoplight and you see these guys giving out poppies, the American Legion really supports the poppies and their annual pledge, because the American Legion, here's another little history lesson, came out of World War I. And very quickly, you might ask, well, how many U.S. soldiers died in World War I? About 47,000. We were only there for about a year and a half. That's a lot in a year and a half, but it's not 1.7 million. And we didn't come back with a 50%, 60% casualty rate. But we did go over and help secure the peace. And we're still living with that 101 years later. Move on real quickly to World War II. Look at that, France capitulates. You hear people talk about this all the time. How could you let the Germans walk in, take over Paris, and just take over your country? Well, this was only 21 years after you've lost, really almost a generation of your men. So you do one of two things. You stand up and fight the Germans again, and maybe you lose another generation and there goes France. It's no longer France. Or you say, wait a minute, let's stop, we'll wait, and what's called capitulation. And the Germans, if you ever seen the picture, Hitler and his crew walking past the Eiffel Tower, and France is split. Russia plays both sides. They really don't want to get involved in this, so they decide to play with the Americans, play with the British, because they despised the Germans as much as we did at that particular time. But at the end of this, what did it create? Two diametrically opposed ideologies, capitalism and communism. It formed a Cold War. Really, a utopian and a dystopian outlook and perspectives. On one side says capitalism is the utopia, communism is the dystopia. We lived with that for over 50 years. But really it was a financial, ethical, and moral beginning of the end of colonialism. France and England and anybody else who had colonies just couldn't afford them anymore. But here's the kicker. That's not academic words. Here's the kicker. The slowly emergent rise of Chinese global influence. After World War II, the Chinese had a start of a civil war between their communists and those who supported capitalism. Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was really beat by the communists and went across a portion of the sea, not very far, to a little island country that you all know right now is Taiwan. The Taiwanese are Chinese, but they're democratic Chinese. And that's really that's part of how China became number 2 in the global economy today. We'll get to that. This is a very interesting slide because these two wars, particularly the first one, are forgotten, ancient history. But they're integral into where we are in the economy today. The Korean War. We spent 3 years in Korea. I'm going to go down to the third bullet. Why did we go to Korean Wars 1950 to 1953? I say to control the ability of the Chinese to influence Asia. Really, by Christmas of 1950, 6 months into that war, we weren't fighting the North Koreans. We were actually fighting the Chinese communists. If you go back and read your history, for the next 2.5 years, we were fighting Chinese soldiers. And here it is 2020, you may have, we've never fought the Chinese. Yes, we were fighting Chinese soldiers. To control the ability of the Chinese to influence Asia. So at that particular time, we were trying to control whether China was able to influence Asia. Move along about 15, 20 years to Vietnam. Vietnam is a watershed moment in American history. global history, painful, but why were we really there? Was it really to prevent Ho Chi Minh from creating a communist North Vietnam versus a democratic South Vietnam? Or was it really because the Chinese were influencing and participating in that war as well? You may not know that the Vietnamese and the Chinese hate each other. After we left Vietnam, they fought a civil war. And the Chinese always wanted to dominate Vietnam. But this bullet here, the Vietnam was to influence the capability of the Chinese to control Asia, not to influence it anymore, but to control it. So if I'm able to do something, I'm trying to control China's ability to influence. That's the Korean War. But now I'm trying to influence whether China's capable now of controlling Asia. That's in the 60s. And we're still dealing with China today. President Nixon goes to China in 1972. No one saw this coming. What did he go for? Some people thought he went to provide a buffer between the USSR and the United States. But it was really open up the economic doors to the Chinese. And this was really laid bare to me. Here's one of my little Army stories. But I remember being in a bar with a special forces individual. We were just talking. This must have been about 20 years ago. And the topic of China came up. And at that particular time, the Chinese were doing this and doing that. You know, my question came up is, why do we keep dealing with the Chinese? And he put it very crystal clear to me. This is 20 years ago. He says, well, what do you want? You want 1 billion people who can't participate in buying and selling in the globe, being able to work? You really want 1 billion people mad at you like that? And I really didn't have anything to say. That was 20 years ago. But that's the impact of President Nixon's visit in 1972. Both of these wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, this is my term, were partially successful in geoeconomic and geopolitical terms, but fully strategically needed, because this really was about China. If you look at the picture there, the top picture is Seoul, Korea. I'm sorry, I gotta do it again, another Army story. I actually got to spend 2 years. I spent 2 years of my life in Seoul, Korea. I have seen that city. I've seen that monument there on top of that hill. This is Seoul, Korea. This is a country that didn't exist in 1950. Didn't exist. And it's a country that's the size of the state of Indiana, but is the 11th largest economy in the world right now. The 11th largest. A country the size of the state of Indiana. The bottom picture is now what's called Ho Chi Minh City, which we all know is Saigon. Seoul, Ho Chi Minh City. This is a result of 2 wars, but it's really about economics. And I just wanted to bring that into perspective there for a sec. Real quick, the fall of the Berlin Wall. All these terms, globalization, global economics, globalism, geoeconomics, they're simply page holders for what's happened now that the Berlin Wall has fallen. There is no evil empire in the Soviet Union. Communism is really non-existent in the world. It's really about democracies and about economies and about how I can get, as a country, what I need for my people so that I can be part of this global trade. So 1992, in the early 90s, we got the European Union. And I call it the faux United Europe with a few reservations. It's a confederation. Our country is a federation. That means we have 50 states under one constitution. The states are separate, have their own free will, so to speak. You can travel between states, but in a confederation, you don't have a uniting constitution. European Union is originally 27 countries with different languages, but they're united through their economics, through the euro. So instead of having a wall between France and Germany and any other European country, it's all open borders now. One passport, you can drive anywhere, but you still have 27 nation states. It's a confederation. And where we are now, with the 2 largest economies in Europe, are Germany and France. Germany and France have always been at odds since 1870. They fought 3 wars, and now they're not the best of friends, but economically they are. And so really it's about Germany, the 4th largest economy in the world, and France, the 5th largest economy in the world. What if they both got together? And there is talk, coordination between them combining their militaries, combining their economies and removing themselves from the EU, all kind of talk. But wouldn't that be interesting for Germany and France to economically, militarily, I don't think they could culturally intertwine like that, but that's where we are in 2020 and beyond. Is it Germany and France, or is it France and Germany? One is the size of Texas, one's the size of Arizona. 4th and 5th largest economies in the world. How did they get there? Because they certainly weren't number 4 or number 5 in 1945. That's a quiz question. Okay, this utopian world we live in right now really happened after 1991. That picture there, I think it's one of those fortnight pictures of London. But the asterisk I put here, the interesting part about England, England is an island. They've always thought of themselves as an island, separate from everyone else. They really didn't want to be part of the European Union, and now they're leaving it. That's what Brexit is, if you've not heard of that, or I'm sure you've heard of the term. It's Britain's exit of the European Union. They don't have anything to do, well, 51% of their population says we don't have anything to do with it. 49% says we want to stay. And the country fought over it the last 4 or 5 years, but they're coming out of the European Union. And a lot of British are scared. A lot of British are just happy as can be. But there's consequences to this. England is not just England, it's the United Kingdom. You got Ireland, you got Scotland. Those 2 countries may want to break away from England. But now the impact of that and these subsequent followers, now England is free, or will be free, to enter into any trade agreement, economic union, free trade zone, anything with any other country, because they're not tied to a confederation. And they're really not connected to the European mainland. When you look back at those isms, England is probably the one and only country that has experienced 6 of those 7 isms, with the exception of communism. England. But this is where we are: trade agreements, economic unions, trade zones, economic communities. I put this in here, a little laughter here. Empire to republic to a fate of memory. You read enough books, you listen to enough people, you think America was modeled after the Romans and we're going to end up like the Romans. But the spread of democracy and language and culture and trade and economic livelihood is neither free nor painless or without envy. And that leads us to, I got about 4 or 5 slides to go. I like this map because it's called a conterminous map. Basically, it just overlaps each country. But you can see how Americans trying to look geographically. Now here we are again. Instead of US and USSR, now it's the US and China for control of this global economy. So how do we do that? Well, you might not know, but the US, believe it or not, has almost 800 military outposts all over the world. 800. Small is 10-person contingents to thousands. 800. The Romans did that as well. The Chinese don't do that. They can't do that. So what they do is they extend their own version of mercantilism across the world. Take Africa. For really the last 10 years, Africa has not needed to go to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Chinese can come in with $1 billion check and say, here, do whatever you want with this $1 billion. Go build a dam, go build some roads, airport, do what you want. However, whatever you build, half of the workers are going to be Chinese, and we're going to own half the company, even though it's in your country. That's a different form of colonialism. And it's interesting what $1 billion or a blank check can do for a country. China's been doing that in Africa. They're doing it in parts of Asia with what's called the Chinese Silk Road Initiative. Last bullet here, he who controls the seas. I'll let you finish that sentence. America's got 2 seas, 2 oceans on both sides of it. We can actually go on either side of the world, or we can defend ourselves from both sides of the world. China can't do that. It can't do that. Will it ever become number 1? I don't think so, because it's not geographically aligned the way America is. So how do you win a trade war? All of these, I would say yes. All of these the globe is doing. Here now in 2020, you just can't escape it. I put the USMCA there last because I do believe, and you look at this picture here of these 2 ships, it's almost 3-dimensional. So if you look at the ships, they look like they're going to collide. But if you look at it again, they're just maybe just staying this far apart from each other. Because if they collide, well, whoever's number 3, 4, 5, 6 could end up being number 2. Neither number 1 or number 2 doesn't want 3, 4, 5 to become number 1 or number 2. And so you have to cooperate, you got to integrate. There is regionalism, there is rising nationalism, but through these geoeconomic means and methods, we can control this global trade war that we're in. I don't know if we'll ever get out of this global trade war. Just about done here. This is a very interesting slide. I actually presented this to a class I taught 2 years ago, undergraduate seniors. This car you may have seen on the road. It's called a Buick Envision. Nice car, about $35,000. But it wasn't originally made here in America. Actually, GM went to China and built it for the Chinese in a plant in China in 2014. It wasn't 2 years later that they decided, okay, well, the Chinese love it so much, maybe the Americans will love it. So let's export this Buick Envision back to America and have Americans buy it. That was fine until the UAW got a hold of it and got mad at General Motors and said, you know what, you could have originally built this car in Lansing, Michigan like we asked you to, but you go to China and build it, and then you export it back to Americans. Now, I posed this question to my class, and it was a business research methods class. And I asked the first part of the 3rd bullet to them. And I had 12 students in this class, 7 males, 5 females. It really didn't come down to gender. It really came down to buying preferences. But I asked the first question, would you purchase a foreign automobile made in America? So all the guys, all the males in the class said, no. I like my Chevrolet, my Dodge, or my American car. I wouldn't do it. I will tell you that the young ladies in the room said, it doesn't matter. As long as I can afford it, it doesn't break down, and it looks good. Okay, well, then I threw a monkey wrench into it. And I said, well, would you buy an American automobile made in China? Then all of a sudden, both sides said, stop and thought about it for a minute, and actually came up with some interesting reasons why they would and why they would not. And then I placed this into the conversation. And this is really for you. Look at the bottom portion of the slide. The Toyota, Nissan, Honda, Volkswagen, Kia, Hyundai, BMW, or Mercedes you drive today is actually built here in America. So you're driving owning a foreign product, but it's made with American hands. So I ask you, would you buy a Buick Envision? It's an American car, but it's assembled by Chinese hands and exported back here to you. They were so discombobulated, I really didn't know what was going to happen. We had a great conversation, but they got so involved, even upset, going back and forth, and we were really just doing business research about why and why not. Why they would buy a Toyota made by an American, but they wouldn't buy a Buick made by a Chinese person. But that's the world we live in nowadays. I drive a GM product. I've researched it. The car is made in Detroit. But I can tell you some of the parts come from Canada and Mexico. It's just built in Detroit. It's a GM product. It's just the way it is nowadays. But this particular piece, this particular slide here really hits home this issue between the #1 economy in the world and the #2 economy in the world. They still sell this car. However, it's not doing well. It hasn't really sold that well in the last 2 or 3 years. And there's talk that it will be stopped. If it's stopped, they'll close the plant in China. And so my last slide here, what's the world going to look like in 15 years? And can geoeconomic parity be attained, controlled, or even altered? So who are the next influential geoeconomic powers in the next 15 years? Is it India? India's come out of nowhere to be a top 10 economy. Right here now in 2020. Is it the continent of Africa, which now has 52 separate countries, none of them communist, all of them democratically, constitutionally run? How about Russia? The Russian Federation, which is what it is right now. How about Japan? Mexico? By the way, Mexico is not really the name of Mexico. It's called the United Mexican States. That's really the name of Mexico. We say Mexico, that's just a shortened version of it. Their official title is the United Mexican States, just like the United States of America. Will Mexico rise? Or how about Indonesia? And so I leave this with you today that 101 years ago is really how we got to 2020. So we're in a trade war, or whatever your definition of a trade war, whatever we want to define trade war is with China. Is it politics by other means? Or are we really trying to, #1 and #2, are we really trying to find the upper hand without ever coming to blows? Really the entire world, whoever the #3 through #50 economies are, cannot be at the whim of #1 and #2 crushing each other. I don't believe the United States will ever allow itself to be anything other than #1. I believe China will try to do as well as it can, as hard as it can, push as strong as it can to become #1. But that's a different kind of battle. It's a geoeconomic, geopolitical battle that will continue at least for the next 1 or 2 generations. I thank you for your time, and I hope that I was able to present some new information to you about our global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buttram. That was fantastic. Folks, if you have some questions you'd like to ask, I see we already have one up. Please put them into type them into the chat box, if you will, and I will relay them to Dr. Buttram. We have a question here. It says, in the past decade or so, China has undertaken an effort to form a globalized region through their Belt and Road Initiative. Conversely, the current administration appears to have undertaken a slow motion withdrawal from its preeminent position. Just a minute. Position geopolitically. If such trends continue and accelerate, what are the implications for the contours of the global economy?
The game, it is a game that we're playing with the Chinese. I will call it the geoeconomic game that we're playing with the Chinese. There's a lot of give and take on both sides. So this trade war added tariffs, reduced the import-export load. We certainly know about the Belt Road Initiative. We know that they're continuing to build it, that they really want to build a road from China all the way to Europe, kind of like a land bridge. Remember, on the west side of China, there is no ocean. There's just only the Himalayas and barren earth until you get to probably the middle part of Romania. But they're actually building this road, and it goes back thousands of years, but it allows them to export, to increase their mercantilism. Now, America, I don't believe, is too worried. I say too worried about the Silk Road Initiative, because really commerce is really governed by what's trafficked and moved and traded over the oceans. And the only country that can guarantee the safety of any country that wants to trade with any country in the world is America. The United States Navy really is the global police of the world's oceans. And so China knows this. And so really the Silk Road Initiative is just really another spoke from their wheel to try to access different markets, because they cannot access them the way America has and the way America can. I think what you're looking at, trying to answer the question, what you're seeing is just another play in a long chess game between the US and China. We've been playing this really since 1950, since the Korean War. And it's really a long game. And if you look at something on TV and the Chinese did this, America did that, that's just a blip. You really have to look at it generationally. And what moves you make now on the chessboard will impact where both will be 15, 20 years from now. I hope I answered the question.
Another question, what might be the advantage to the United States if we were to attempt to re-enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
It might not be economically feasible to do that at this particular point. When you look at the Pacific, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, even portions of India, these have become economic nation states that can, that are taking almost a nationalistic viewpoint on what they can do for themselves. So the TPP was really kind of a bulwark against China. America, we try to align with these, with the rising and really strong Asian economies that really don't get along with the Chinese, just never have. But in the world we're in now today, you have to get along with them. You have to trade. You have to play nicely. But I think now in 2020, even 15 years from now, even though we have a European Union, an African Union, USMCA, don't know if the TPP is necessarily necessary right now. Again, that's another chess piece that could come forward if the Chinese were to falter in some other economic lane. We could always resurrect the TPP. You might not have the same countries that were interested in it 4 or 5 years ago. It might be a different version of it. But right now, I think that nationalism piece is becoming more and more like what it looked like between World War I and World War II. If I got a strong enough economy and I can trade, I really don't need you over here, and I don't need you that much. I need you, but I don't need you all that much, because now I can find another partner and I'm still able to be profitable and manage my country. That's how the globe has become, and I don't think the TPP will be, I don't think it'll be a conversation point for a while.
Do you have any thoughts on international finance and how it might change in the near future?
I just read an article, brief article yesterday about he was a German, he used to be the German defense minister, Gutenberg. And he was working on a dissertation, found that he had plagiarized some pieces of it. But his dissertation was on the future of banking, particularly in Europe, and about different types and different methods of finance, and how that will change, and how it will change the bank itself, the definition of a bank. But the article went on to say that Gutenberg even though that was about 4 years ago, he's come back and gotten another. Now he's gone and went to another institution. I do believe it's in England, and now has a doctorate in international. It's either international finance or it's banking. And I think I have not read his dissertation, seen what the title is, but the synopsis was Gutenberg. Some think he may replace Angela Merkel, but his thoughts, his dissertation, his reasonings about how the international finance, global international finance could change, would actually change how everything we talked about tonight. So it could be Bitcoin, currency could go away, it could be all electronic. I'm not well versed enough in international finance to really answer that, but I can tell you, just reading this article about this potential future German prime minister and his dissertation on international finance and where it will go in the next 20 years really was interesting, and it's kind of topical based off the question here. I'm not well versed enough to answer it fully, other than I believe it will change and that it will impact the global economy one way or the other.
Thank you. Anyone else, if you'd like to put forward a question, I'll give you a moment to write it. One thing I was wondering about, we talk about the different unions like the EU and whatnot, the African Union. Do you see those unions in general strengthening or weakening in the future?
I see them weakening. They're weakening now. The EU is actually relatively weak. Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. France is right behind it. And what they say really goes in that union. They've lost England. England just didn't want to participate anymore and exited itself from the European Union. And there are about 2 other countries that really want to do the same thing England's done. One of them is Italy. One of them is Spain. Now, it'd be interesting if Italy and Spain left the EU, because it would probably cause some kind of cascading event where other countries were to leave the EU. The EU was a great idea, but that's just what it was. It was an idea. The African Union was actually modeled after the EU, and it was a way to. It was really a scaffolding type of union where they had Africa had a organization of African states, organizations of African Union from the late 60s up until the creation of the African Union. But the African Union is a confederation much like the EU is. And right now, there is a serious action that 5 East African countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Malawi, I believe, all these countries surround Lake Victoria. But they're deciding to go with an East Africa Federation, not a confederation, a federation where they'll have one currency, one constitution, and that 5-country union will all of a sudden vault itself into the top 20 economies in the world. And so economic unions like the EU and the AU, they serve their purpose, but I believe they're going to come to their end, and it's going to come more down to regionalism and nationalism. It's really where the globe is going now, because there's become so much parity and economic parity among even some of the smallest countries that you didn't even think about a decade, 2 decades ago, but are now so caught up in the global economy that they can function on their own. Well, if I can function on my own and you want to do the same thing, you want to do the same thing. Now you have 5 African countries that they're really in the final talks of their constitution, and they'll have their own federation carved out of Africa, 5 countries. I think it will go down to regionalist federations and away from big Confederate type unions.
Thank you for joining us for today's program. Please feel free to visit any location of the Allen County Public Library for additional resources regarding business and economics. Particularly the Business Science and Technology Department offers a large print collection as well as digital databases. In addition, there are research tools on our website, such as A to Z databases, Udemy, and Inspire, which can help you research anything from how many gas stations are in your zip code to working on an academic paper. People at all of our locations will be happy to help you with your research. The library is currently partnering with the Northeast Indiana Innovation Center on a series of virtual programs about how to start your own business. If you want to know how to get started, the first program will be offered on November 19th. We are also in collaboration with Work One Northeast. A previous program on preparing a resume is on the library's YouTube channel, and there are two more coming up. The program in October is about cover letters, and the program in November is about networking. The purpose of the workshops is to help those who have lost their jobs because of the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. If you are interested in these programs or any of our other upcoming virtual programs for children, adults, and teens, please go to our website at www.acpl.info, where you can find a comprehensive list of events under the Events tab, located at the top of the home page. Most of these events require registration in advance. Finally, thank you for joining today's program. If you have any questions about any of the resources offered by the Allen County Public Library, please email us at ask@acpl.info. That link is also in your chat box. Finally, this program was recorded. It will be archived on our YouTube channel in about a week or two. So if you'd like to see it again or recommend it to a friend, please feel free to do so. On behalf of Dr. Buttram and the staff at Access Fort Wayne, have a great evening and good night.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.